Now thrive the Armourers.
Welcome to the Armourers and Brasiers podcasts. In this, our 700th anniversary year, we thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about the company from its earliest days right through to the present. And during the course of the podcast, you'll hear from a variety of people talking about different topics during our long and varied history. Each podcast will cover a different century, and we very much hope that you both enjoy and learn something from them.
That was Nicky Davis, master of the company in this, our 700th anniversary year, and the first woman to hold that office. I'm Guy Wilson, and Kay Smith and I will be guiding you through the 700 years of the Armourers Brasiers Company. We begin in the 14th century. Here's Kay to tell you more.
First, we're going to look at the earliest evidence of the London Armourers organising themselves and their trade. And we'll look too at what those armourers were making. Of course, there have been armourers working in London for centuries, but we know almost nothing about them. They have left little trace. Not even many of their names survive, let alone examples of what they were made. Probably few, if any of them, could read or write, and in any case they didn't want anybody to know the secrets of their craft, their mystery. So they passed their knowledge and skills down by word of mouth. What we do have, though, is a wealth of contemporary imagery, and it's largely this that enables us to build up a picture of what the London Armourers were making in response to the demands of the society in which they lived and worked.
Here to explain further is Dr. Toby Capwell, curator of the collection of arms and armour at the Wallace Collection and a distinguished authority on medieval armour.
One of the things that I find really fascinating about the early history of the Armourers Company is the way in which its organization is defined by the state of armor technology at that particular moment.
But what exactly were these armourers making? What did this armour look like? Most of us will probably have an image of a man covered from head to toe in bright steel plates, the classic knight in shining armour. But armour wasn't like that in the early 14th century, as Dr. Tom Richardson, formerly Curator of Armour at the Royal Armouries, explains.
The term armourer in the 14th century really covered a multitude of crafts. There were mail makers who made armour out of drawn wire links linked together and riveted to make mail garments. There were plate armour makers. Some of them were called helmers because they forged helms out of solid plate. Those armourers also produced plate armour for the body and for the limbs, and most of that was covered in fabric in the middle years of the 14th century. And even gauntlets of plate in the middle of the 14th century were covered in fabric. A lot of the plate armour, as we also know from 14th century accounts, wasn't made of metal at all, it was made of hardened leather.
So we get a picture of a range of different sorts of armourers and skills. Helmet makers making helmets out of plates of iron. Mail makers using iron wire to make rings, which they fashioned together to make mail. And linen armourers making padded fabric defences.
The first evidence we have of London armourers joining together to regulate their trade dates to 1322. Hence, 2022 is being celebrated as the company's 700th anniversary. In testing times, they were faced with a dilemma which has always plagued industry down to the present day: how to maintain the reputation and quality of their products. Their solution was to get together as a group, start negotiations with the City of London authorities, and hammer out a legal agreement to regulate their trade.
The result was a document that starts with a preamble detailing who from the city was involved.
Be it remembered that at the husting of common pleas holden on Monday, the feast of the conversion of St. Paul, in the 15th year of the reign of our Lord King Edward, son of King Edward, in presence of Hayman de Chigwell, the then mayor, Nicholas de Farndon, Robert de Swalcleve and other aldermen, and Richard Costantin and Richard de Hackney, sheriffs.
Professor John Davis of Liverpool University has examined and researched this document for us. No easy task.
Now, it's written in Norman French, which I found, not being an expert in anything to do with medieval writing, very difficult to decipher. I got some of my colleagues from the University of Liverpool History Department to help me on my way, and I'm very grateful for their help. And I have managed to create a transcription and a translation, and it is a very clear, sensible document which shows a group of armourers of various kinds coming together and making an application to the city for not so much recognition as an acceptance of the way in which they wish to proceed corporately for the sake of making sure that standards among the trade are maintained.
So let's look at this important document in a little more detail. What does it say after the preamble?
It then lists 27 armourers who had been involved in the negotiations, including homers, who were helmet makers, and hobugers, who made mail.
Lanshull, Richard de Kent, Gilo le Hoburger, Hugh le Homer, Master Richard le Homer, Simon le Homer, Robert de Skelton, John Taney.
What is also intriguing is that some, such as William de Lindsay, came from as far away as Lincolnshire. Then, the agreement sets out the required standards for fabric armour, both what it should be made of and how it should be padded.
That a hacketon and a gambeson covered with sendal or with cloth of silk shall be stuffed with new cotton cloth and with cadaz and with old sendals and in no other manner.
The document then turns to helmets. Bassinets, the typical helmet of the time, were not to be sold covered with textile or leather before they had been inspected and approved by the armourers. Here's Tom Richardson again.
One of the problems with a completely unregulated craft, such as armour making in the 14th century, and the predilection of armourers and their clients to have their armour covered either with textiles or with leather, was that the quality of the plates underneath was invisible. This particularly applied to helmets, bassinets, the type of helmets that were worn by ordinary soldiers, by archers and the occasional spearmen in the army. So clearly a group of armourers who were producing armour of good quality felt that the unregulated trade meant that less skilled manufacturers were passing off any old rubbish which was covered in leather so the client couldn't tell it was rubbish as top quality armour, and they wanted regulation within the craft so that they could inspect the plate defence before it was covered in leather to make sure it was good quality.
It is ordained and assented to that no smith or other man who makes the irons for bassinets shall from henceforth himself cause any bassinet to be covered for sale.
Finally, the sting is in the tail of the document. At the very end, they say, and any armour that's found within London that's for sale can be brought before the mayor and aldermen and a committee of the armourers to judge whether it's any good or not, and if not, it can't be sold, giving plenipotentiary powers essentially to a group of armourers to control the trade in armour within themselves in London.
And if there shall be found in any house, whether it be of an armourer or elsewhere, whosoever house it may be, armour on sale of any kind whatsoever which is not of proper quality, or other than has been ordained, such armour shall be immediately taken and brought before the mayor and aldermen, and by them adjudged upon as being good or bad.
This is an example of the way in which a guild or a company is not a trade union, but is not an employers' union either. It is both at the same time.
Now, although this document does not necessarily mark the establishment of a formal armourers' company as we know it, it does set a point in time when a group of armourers got together to protect their trade. And they may already have been organised in some way. After all, one of the 27 is named as Master Richard, the helmet maker. Whatever the exact circumstances, it is from this seed that the armourers were able to grow and develop.
What is also clear is that the granting of these rights by the city's authorities had a secondary purpose.
There is anxiety on the part of the Crown that London was not fully controllable. It had been given a devolved administration nearly a century previously, but it wasn't fully autonomous, and after all, London at that stage was a city of something like 80,000 people, crammed inside the city walls, very, very crowded indeed. And that, of course, was one reason why so many people died in the Black Death 25 years later. But it did mean that a rumbustious set of young adult apprentices could, on a Saturday night, wreak very considerable damage to either the premises or the persons of the city. So you can understand that the Crown has a need, or feels a need, to make sure that the city is under control. So there was certainly a severe eye being kept by the king's judges and ministers on what was going on in the city.
One of the things that was increasingly going on in London was the making of plate armour. And in a crowded city, where homes were often right next to workshops, the noisy craft of armour making could lead to complaints. In 1378, one armourer was taken to court by those living next to his workshop because, they said, his great hammers shake the walls of our tenement, deprive us and our servants of rest by day and night, spoil the wine and ale in our cellar, and fill our homes with the smoke of sea coal, thus, of course, reducing considerably the value of their property. Shakespeare spoke truly when he talked of busy hammers and dreadful notes of preparation.
And it would appear that not all armourers were law-abiding citizens. In July 1393, Thomas Buckingham, armourer, was accused of ravishing and abducting Clarice, the wife of William Harding, at Westminster, and of robbing him to boot.
For England, the 14th century was a period of continuing, though intermittent, warfare. There was the long struggle against Scotland, decades of fighting in France, and there were campaigns in Spain, as well as rebellions and revolts at home to be dealt with too. The London Armourers were busy, sometimes too busy, and the monarch's need to make fighting his wars a little more affordable sometimes caused problems for them. At least twice they were forbidden by King Edward III to raise their prices in order to facilitate his foreign campaigns. Yes, it helped his war effort. Yes, it prevented profiteering, but it did not shield the armourers from rising prices. Another reason, then, for armourers to join together, as Toby Capwell explains.
The company was essentially founded as a way of protecting the industry of armour making. Armourers were in a really difficult position in the 14th century because they were making things that were militarily important. But they were also subjects of the crown. The king was their ruler, their lawgiver, but he was also their biggest client. And there was an inherent conflict of interest there that often in the 14th century led to armourers being taken advantage of or even suppressed financially. And the company was a way of trying to organize and gain self-control of their own industry.
We have very little knowledge of just how large the company was in the 14th century and how much armour they could make. However, Tom Richardson's researches into the Tower of London, the King's principal military storehouse, give us some idea of what was going on, as Tom explains.
One of the problems that the armourers in London had in the second quarter of the 14th century is that there weren't actually that many of them, and they weren't capable of supplying all that much material. And therefore, when something like the 100 Years' War happened, it simply wasn't possible for the indigenous population of armourers to produce the amount of kit that was needed by the army in a big hurry to take on campaign next year. So most of what was actually used by the English army in the 14th century was imported from abroad.
But how did the English fight their battles, and what were the different types of soldiers that made up their army?
Under the reign of Edward III, we find an establishment of what we call the English system, which essentially comprised two major troop types. There were infantry archers using the longbow, who were issued with a certain amount of armour, but not all that much at this period. And there were the men-at-arms, the feudal nobility, who were obliged to serve on the basis of property qualification and fought by this time on foot. They rode horses to battle and on campaign, but they fought on foot wearing complete armour.
So what were these various soldiers wearing?
The armour that the nobles had been wearing up until the second quarter of the 14th century had been mail. And essentially during this period, by the end of the 13th century, mail starts being reinforced with plate defences.
It also appears that soldiers were issued with a mixed bag of pieces of armour and were not necessarily wearing armour made as a set.
Interestingly, though they were issued by the king to his newly ennobled nobles who didn't have any armour as suits of armour, they weren't supplied like that. When we look at the armourers' records, you find a whole heterogeneous bundle of stuff being supplied by each armourer and then clearly being put together in the Privy Wardrobe at the Tower of London for issue to men-at-arms.
Although we have little further information about the armourers as a group, that is, as a company, in the 14th century, we do know quite a bit about one particular armourer, Simon Winchcombe, who was working at the end of the century. Toby Capwell explains.
Simon Winchcombe was one of the major London armourers in the late 14th century. He was fabulously successful commercially, very rich, and increasingly became a very influential figure, not just within the armour-making community, but within the wider civic culture of London at the time. And he's important for another reason, which is that unusually for armourers, his will survives. And it's very detailed, and it tells us a lot about his workshop, his tools. All of his hammers are listed, his stakes, anvils, barrels for rolling mail to clean it. They reveal that he was probably a dealer of arms and armor as well as a maker. And sometimes it's quite hard to tell what the difference is, because the dealers of armor often are called armorers as well.
While we have no hard and fast evidence of how the armourers organised themselves later in the 14th century, we do know that they had become a fully fledged company. In 1387, they joined with other livery companies to petition the king against corruption in the city's government, a sign of their growing strength and organisation. The armourers were ready for the challenges of the future.
Next time, a new century brings new challenges and new opportunities. The armourers acquire a royal charter and a permanent home. This has been a Past Master production for Basilisco Press. Our thanks to Toby Capwell, John Davis and Tom Richardson.